Thanks very much, Juan Pablo. Interesting little dilemma we've got here. I was thinking I was going to be speaking in Spanish, so I've prepared my notes in Spanish. I'll be interpreting back into English simultaneously. So good luck with that. But it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a bit of a novelty actually being on a university campus. Actually being in a room with so many people, it's a bit scary after so long being locked up at home and in the office and only with very small numbers of people. But very happy to be here. I think Juan Pablo sort of set the scene very well, touched on quite a few of the points I was going to make, but I thought it might be good just to sort of explain a little bit Australia's approach to trade policy. We've got a history between our two countries of working very closely on trade policy matters. I've spent probably half of my career in Latin America. It's my second posting here. I have a Chilean wife, a country I'm very fond of. But I've also spent a lot of my time while I've been overseas and back in Australia working on trade policy, working on FTA negotiations. I was a member of the team that negotiated the free trade agreement between Australia and Chile. I was also on the team that negotiated the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and my colleague Joe was involved in the TPP 11 process. So at the embassy we actually got quite a bit of experience and knowledge on trade policy matters. Just stating the obvious, and Juan Pablo's already sort of referred to this, Australia is a country which is open to the world. It's a country that it depends on trade in the same way that Chile does, where large countries that produce certain things in volume that we produce it in volumes much beyond what our own requirements are. So we're looking for markets, and if you're looking for markets, you need to be open to the world. Australia, up until the time of the pandemic, we were saying that Australia was, had the record for the most number of years of consecutive growth. So we had 28 years of consecutive growth right up until the pandemic. And many would say, and I would join this in saying that it was in large part because of our openness, because we had opened our economy, because we were committed to exposing our industries to competition. And our experience has been, and I think Chile's experience has been, if you expose yourself to competition, and I'm not an economist, but I know there are economists in the room, you're going to create more efficient and more competitive business, and that's what we've seen, and that's why we're committed to continuing along this path. One very important thing. Chile has a new government, and it's a very interesting time, fascinating time to be here, particularly on trade policy matters. I've never seen so much commentary in an election campaign on trade matters, so that's fascinating for us. But we've also just had an election. So this weekend just gone, we had an election and we had a change of government. So the coalition, which was the centre-right parties, two parties, that have been in government for 9 years, they lost, and they're being replaced by the Labor Party, which is the centre-left party in Australian politics. And I sort of tend to equate Australian politics to the Chile of when I was last posted here, the Chile of la Concertación and Chile Vamos, is centre-left, centre-right, and they're alternating between one and the other. And so we've seen a bit of that, and I was just explaining to Juan Pablo on the way in that the one thing that did change in this election was the vote of those two groups has dropped off, and we've seen, we don't know how many there will be, but there'll be something like 15 to 18 Green and independent members of the lower house, which we've never seen before. So that's going to make it fascinating. But on trade policy, I think I can say with some confidence that we don't expect to see significant changes between the previous government and the current government, the new government. And the new government, one of the things it's sort of said it will be emphasising is doing more to address climate change. So we may see some of these some of these progressive issues that we talk about in free trade agreements, like labour chapters, environment chapters, looking at ways to address gender in free trade agreements. They may get more attention, but the fundamental policies will remain the same. Just to give you some idea, just so we're talking about the scale of our economy, as I say, we're export dependent. We export, and I used 2019 figures, so just before the pandemic. I think that tells a more accurate story of our history. but our exports in that year were 266 back to English, 266 billion dollars, US dollars of exports, and 221 billion dollars of imports. Our majority, the majority of our trade, so over 65% of our exports go to Asia. And if you look at our top 10 trading partners, it's a very similar list to Chile. So our number one export market by a long way is China. And in two-way terms, it's China, the US, Japan, the Republic of Korea, the United Kingdom, Singapore, New Zealand, India, Germany, and Malaysia. So just like Chile, we have quite a diverse export spread, and that's a good place to be in. In terms of the nature of our exports, so the export of minerals and energy are key. Something like around 175 million of that 266 million are resources. So primarily iron ore, coal, and liquefied natural gas. So they're really big exports for us, and they do, the majority of them are heading to Asia. We also have a services sector which is growing very fast. So our services exports currently account for $65 billion worth each year. Manufactures about 37 billion. But also, just like Chile, we have an important agriculture sector, we have a fisheries industry, and we also have a forestry industry. And while the numbers in terms of what they generate in terms of value may not look as important in terms of jobs, obviously agriculture does generate a lot of employment for our community. Australia hasn't only been a trading nation from European settlement. So the English settled Australia in the late 1770s, but even before then there was trade going on. So Indonesians would come to Australia, to the far north of the country, and buy things off the Aboriginal people, which would then be sold onto China. When we've federated, so Australia's a federation, so it's a federal government. We have 6 states and two autonomous territories. Initially, they were operating very independently, and there were tariff barriers between them, which was very inefficient. So it was around the time of federation in 1901 that those barriers were removed. So it was sort of a sign of things that were going to come down the track. But even then, at the beginning of last century, trade, so foreign trade, accounted for 42% of our GDP. Just to give you a bit of a summary of where we're at, so we have, as I said at the beginning, we're very committed to opening our markets. Until about 2003, 2005, our sole focus in terms of trade liberalisation, we had a very firm commitment to the WTO. We weren't looking to negotiate free trade agreements. We only had one in place, and that was from 1983, I think, with New Zealand, which is a very, we call it CER, Closer Economic Relations. So that was the only free trade agreement we had for 20 years. 20 years? Yeah, 10 years. 20 years, sorry. And then when we made the decision to negotiate free trade agreements, very quickly our policy changed, and we were committed to going down that path, in addition to our unwavering commitment to the World Trade Organization, which is still our preference. Multilateral trade liberalisation is always going to deliver the best outcomes. But we think that we can, as we say, chew gum and walk at the same time. So we have, I mentioned our bilateral agreement with Chile. We have an agreement with the one I mentioned with New Zealand, and then I think it was in this order: Singapore, the US, Thailand, Chile. So Chile was our 5th free trade agreement, our first free trade agreement with a Latin American country. And since then, we've negotiated free trade agreements, comprehensive, high-quality free trade agreements with all of our major trading partners. with the exception of the European Union, which is currently under negotiation at the moment. So we have FTAs with China, Japan, Korea. We have a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries, together with New Zealand, and that's an agreement that the previous Chilean government expressed an interest in joining, and that's something that we're supportive of. And then there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which entered into force for, I think it's now in force for 8 of the 11 signatories to the TPP-11. Obviously, one of the ones that hasn't entered into force for is Chile, and interested in, if we have any questions about that. But that's something that featured in the political debate, continues to feature in the political debate here. I'm conscious of the time, and I think I've covered off on most of my points. And maybe I know you want to ask me some questions, and then I think you'll get more out of this if you can ask me questions about the stuff that you're interested in. And I'm happy to take questions in Spanish or English, whichever you prefer.
All right.
Thanks very much.
All right. So just to kick things off, could you, tell us a little bit about what is being an ambassador in that role? Because, we all watch the movies and everybody has some kind of like an idea what an ambassador is, what you do. But if you, especially because we have a pretty young audience, and I know that at the very least, there are so many of my students that are interested in diplomacy and so on and so forth. So if you could, explain a little bit about yourself and your role.
Yeah, so maybe you can talk with my team over coffee later. They can tell you what I really do. But I mean, looking at in a nutshell, I suppose what I do and what the embassy does here is to advance and protect Australia's interests. So when you think about, so I'm the ambassador, but I mean I head a team which is pretty diverse. We have many more Chileans working in the embassy than we have Australians working in the embassy. So having a diplomat overseas is actually an expensive. It's not that they pay me a lot of money, but there's all, they have to send me here, they have to provide me with a house, they have to provide me with an office. So there's a lot of additional expenses in having a diplomat sent overseas. So we do rely a lot on local staff. So they're a very valuable members of our team. They know the country that we're in. They live here. They often spend a lot longer in the embassy than we do. But in terms of what we're trying to do, so as I say, advancing Australia's interest, a very practical thing. If you're an Australian that visits Chile and you lose your passport or you have an accident, then the embassy provides consular and passport support. But frankly, I mean, I don't spend a lot of my time on that. Although when I arrived in February of 2020, so just before the pandemic hit, so I did actually for the first year spend a lot of my time trying to help Australians get home and trying to help Chileans and Argentinians get home through Santiago. So that can sometimes take up a lot of my time. But the sort of thing that I think might be of most interest. So we're talking about trade policy today. So going in and speaking with Sure and other, with the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Agriculture on trade policy issues that are of concern to us. So going in and basically seeing if there's scope for Australia and Chile to sort of work together to advance a particular area of interest. So if we've got concerns with the behaviour of another country, and we're looking at taking action in the WTO, we might have a conversation with Chile about that. If we're looking to advance a particular initiative in a forum like APEC, for example, then that's the sort of thing that Joe or I might go into the Foreign Ministry and have a conversation about.
In that sense, we know that the current government only has been in office for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. How has been, the current Chilean government, let's say, openness to talk, or because we've all watched the news, read the newspapers, and there seems to be a little bit of, maybe it's taking some time for them to really get the hands into the job and all that. So what's that has been on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I've had I mean, somebody was complaining, I don't know if they're complaining or they were saying, oh, you're very busy at the moment, because I've been meeting with a lot of ministers and subsecretarios, and so there's been a lot of meetings recently, getting to know one another. But look, I think it's understandable. You're talking about, and I think we speak freely. If if Jasna Provoste had have won and had become president, then there's a huge pool of people that have been in government before. Um, if 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 somebody from, I don't know, yeah, if somebody from the former Chile Vamos had won, then there's a pool of people that I can draw on. So it's a completely new coalition, and you can see, and they've drawn on some former concertación figures. So it's obviously going to take some time for them to settle in, but we've had really positive conversations so far on trade policy, on investment. Some of the things that that of most interest. One thing I haven't mentioned is, a very important part of my role here is supporting Australian business. So we have very significant investments in Chile, particularly in the mining sector, but in other sectors as well. I've found in the conversations I've had to date a real openness and a willingness to listen. And I've got to say, on some of the things, I think we'll get into some more detail shortly. I've actually found that their thinking is evolving. One of the issues that we'll get to is around this idea that was floated during the campaign to review all free trade agreements, the position of the government on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so the TPP-11. When the messaging, what we've heard from the president, from the foreign minister, suggests some nuancing, so some slightly different messaging to what we'd initially heard.
You know what? I'm honestly shocked. My read was completely different from an outsider's perspective. Reading the news and all that, I legitimately thought that the new authorities would be more difficult to approach, that wouldn't be as open in these kind of elements, especially trade policy, due to everything that we saw during the campaign and all that. So that is legitimately good thing to know.
Because, and I'm not overstating that. I think we've had a very frank. I haven't met all of the figures in government yet, but I have meetings coming up. So within the next few weeks, I would have met certainly those ministers, subsecretarios that deal with trade policy. I would have met them all within the next week or so. So no, it's been very open, and it's early days. But there's going to be opportunities as well at the ministerial level over the coming months. So just this past weekend, the APEC ministers responsible for trade meeting was held in Bangkok. Our minister wasn't there because we didn't have a minister. It was a day of the election.
Right.
So our ministers haven't yet met yet, but we think there'll be an opportunity. We hope in the coming months. There'll be a meeting in Paris, OECD. Trade ministers meeting coming up shortly. I think it's in June. So we're hoping there might be an opportunity there for ministers to engage.
All right. Well, that is legitimately interesting, and that somewhat sets the stage for what I want to talk. So, look, you've been to Chile multiple times. You have family here and all that. You mentioned about your wife. So, from an outsider perspective, and in all the time that you've been linked to Chile, would you say that trade liberalization has helped the country?
Yeah, I think unquestionably, but I know that's there's nuances, there's different points of view, but I think and there's a question about this process that Chile's going through. What you've been through over the last 2.5 years with the Estadio Social and the constitutional process that's underway. So, I know there's differing views, but I think as at the macro level, I think there's no question that Chile has benefited from its openness to the world. I think you look at any other country in Latin America, and maybe Peru is another good example, but Peru was really, in my view, sort of followed in Chile's footsteps. So you've had 30 years of Chile, opening its economy, and behaving like a developed country. So Chile, in my experience as a trade negotiator, wasn't looking for additional flexibilities as a developing country. It was behaving like a developed country. I remember when I was on my first posting in Mexico in the sort of second half of the 90s, and they were talking about, so NAFTA, so the old NAFTA ended in force, I think, in 94, and so 96, 97, there was talk about could Chile be the next member of NAFTA. So even back then, so it's 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, Chile was being talked about as the next cab off the rank, if you like.
So on the one hand, we have, Chile and this trade policy very open. We've seen that for over 30 years. On the other hand, we see something quite similar in Australia. In both countries, we export similar products, mostly raw materials, okay, with some nuance, as you mentioned. Yeah. And this approach has been questioned quite a bit. So on your end, what's your take on this approach to trade policy, to open and export raw materials? What might be the challenges of this approach in the 21st century?
Yeah. Look, I think you have to play to your strengths. So like if you've got an abundance of copper or salitre or wool or natural gas, and the world needs those things, then you're going to export them, or you're going to shoot yourself in the foot otherwise. So I think that's a fact. But I think Australia is a good example of the sort of all of the things that you can build around that. So it's not just simply, and there's a tendency, I think, to sometimes just simplify things and say we're just digging stuff out of the ground and we're just selling it, and then the big companies are making all the money. But those just the mining operations themselves create jobs and wealth in communities, and there's a lot of support that goes into that. So there's a lot of services. So the services number that I referred to before, you can add to that all the services associated with delivering these things. So I think we need to be careful not to sort of fall into the trap of saying Australia is just a mine, a dumb country. You look at we have something like 200 plus Australian companies with a presence in Chile. The largest of all of them would be BHP. They operate Escondida, so the world's largest copper mine in Chile's north. But that's not 200 BHPs. We're talking about the largest group of those countries would be METs. So Australian companies that have developed a technology or a service associated with mining. And they didn't just appear overnight. I mean, they developed, because the mining industry in Australia needed, those services, those technologies, and they're now exporting to countries like Chile. And so they're using Chile as a base, and now some of them have opened offices in Peru. So, and Chile can do the same. I mean, it's early days, but I know one Chilean company that actually has set up in Australia. So they manufacture the big bins on the back of the trucks in the mining industry here, and they emerged from Chile. They now have their biggest operation is now in Australia, Duratrade, so based in Melbourne, and we're seeing other Chilean companies that have sort of had some success here now going further afield. So I think and the current government, the new government in Chile, is very mindful of that. So what they want to see is new industries develop around the mining sector. And it's not just mining. I mean, obviously for Australia and Chile, mining is very important, but, and education as well, education services to support the mining industry, to support the agriculture sector.
So look, when we look at value chains and all that, and we see how industrial economies engage with mostly raw exporters, raw material exporters, like let's say the US and Chile or China, so on and so forth, we see the obvious benefits of the value chains. However, in your position, what have you seen other than these companies? What kind of not necessarily value chain, but what kind of cooperation we can achieve between two countries that focus on raw materials, because that's one of the key issues when you look at it, because the benefits of Chile engaging with China are evident.
Yeah.
But again, you look at Chile and you look at Australia, and that that becomes a problem because it's not that obvious what we can do together. There's obviously some room for that, but it is a problem because again, a lot of people see these, see like, okay, you're just digging stuff from the ground.
Yeah. I mean, just so your outrageous claim that Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon is better than Chile than Australian Shiraz. I mean, that's actually I do like Chilean wine. I have to, or my wife would divorce me. But I think there's wine's different. Wine or I don't know, something, cheese, something like that, where like I think, yeah, we're competing with one another very directly. But when it comes to, say, lithium or green hydrogen, I mean, I think just to sort of illustrate a point I wanted to make. I mean, I was down in Magallanes the week before last, went to see some green hydrogen operations there, and just like, to me, it sort of summed up, something. So there's this one company that's got a pilot project that it's building down in, just outside of Punta Arenas, and it's looking at replicating that project in Australia. It's a Chilean company. There happens to be a couple of Australians that work for that company. So there's this sort of connection. And so it's an industry that doesn't really exist. And it's an industry that's going to produce something on a huge scale, because the demand for what they're going to be able to produce is going to be so huge. There's no point Chile and Australia sort of going off in a corner trying to sort of win out over the other. I mean, what we need to do is we need to work together to create this industry, and do it not only as potential, well, not potential, actual real suppliers, and work together with the customers. So, and I know Chile is very advanced, Australia is very advanced, and we're the two countries that have the greatest potential when it comes to green hydrogen. And similarly, when you think about, I know with the government here and the new government in Australia, there's been a real focus on, well, we've got, so at the moment, Australia is a country that produces the most lithium, but Chile is a country with the most lithium in the ground. So, and we've got a lot of lithium and you've got a lot more, but between the two of us, we've got a lot of the lithium, and there's an interest in both countries to sort of, we'll value add rather than just sort of putting it on a boat and shipping it off to somewhere else, most likely China. There's potential for us to sort of actually value add at home, and I think there's potential for our two countries to actually collaborate on that sort of thing. And the last example I was going to give, and there's a real focus on this at the moment. I was talking with what CSIRO is, the Commonwealth Science and Industry Research Office. So it's like the NASA of Australia. It's this huge scientific research organisation in Australia, and they have an office here in Chile. And they're very interested. One of the things they're focusing on is rare earths and critical minerals. And so what we've realised is that both Australia and Chile send ore to China, and that ore, in addition to containing a lot of copper, that's why we've sent it there, it also contains a lot of other rare minerals that are very, very, very valuable. And in China, I'm not sure what happens in other countries, they're extracting these, and they're very valuable. So there's another area where I think the two countries could work together to sort of identify better ways of extracting that and making use of that resource which is coming out of our own territory. So yeah, there's a couple of examples where I think we're not talking about competition. We're talking, what is it, co-opetition. So it's cooperation and competition happening at the same time.
I like what you say, because based on this conversation and the literature available, free trade obviously benefits all countries, and we see this this win-win situation between countries that that export raw materials or that export industrial products, so on and so forth. So taking that in consideration, we have something that I'm particularly particularly interested in, I'm actually working on my PhD dissertation on that, the CPTPP, the mega trade regional agreements. Okay, and we know that Chile was part of that negotiation, but then when it came to ratify the agreement, well, that's still sleeping in Congress today. So the question is really simple. From from an Australian perspective, and as a major trading partner of Chile, and more than that, as a stakeholder of this agreement, uh, the first question would be, and it's rather obvious: do you think that we're missing out by not ratifying that, and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's so personally, I mean, it's unfortunate, but we entirely understand that Chile has to go through this process, and the TPP 11 or CPTPP was passed by the lower house at Cámara de Diputados in 2019, but then it became a bit of a lightning rod for criticism. So it became it became the agreement which sort of personified, or exemplified the concerns that some people have about free trade agreements. And we've heard similar concerns raised in Australia. And as a government, we've engaged, we've responded, and we've tried to sort of explain why, on balance, it's clearly in Australia's interest. One of the criticisms of the TPP-11, which you don't hear so much about other free trade agreements, but it was negotiated in exactly the same way, is that it was done behind closed doors, and it was secretive. But any agreement, any treaty that by definition, it's going to be negotiated because there's going to be lots of ideas put out there. But my experience, having participated in the first couple of years of the negotiations, was that it was there was a lot of involvement by stakeholders. So at each round, we would sort of speak with stakeholders from across the spectrum. So obviously industry, but also the union movement, talking about Australian stakeholders, and other groups that had reservations about pursuing free trade agreements. But I think it's for us, we would like to see Chile on board. We would like to see Chile ratify, because we think that it would strengthen the agreement. We think that the more countries that are on board and that are bound by the very high standards that the TPP establishes, the stronger the agreement is. It'll also make it more attractive to other countries wanting to join. So we think if because the plan with the TPP was always to grow over time. And don't forget, I mean, the TPP, the original TPP, came about because 4 countries, Chile, Singapore, New Zealand, and Brunei, had signed an agreement in, I think, 2006 or 5. I was here at the time, and bizarrely, Chile would, every time I would go into Direcon, well, not every time, but often I would go to Direcon, and they'd be encouraging Australia, why don't you join? And at that time, we weren't in that space. We weren't looking to. But now we're part of the agreement, and just not to have Chile there just doesn't seem right. But again, it's a decision for Chile to take. But we think that Chile is missing out. We think that there are opportunities that other countries, Peru, for example, which is the most recent country to ratify the agreement, that Chile is going to be at a disadvantage. The other thing I think is important. So as I said, the idea was for the agreement to expand over time. So we've already commenced the process with the United Kingdom. We've had expressions of interest from China, from Taiwan. We've had an expression of interest from my other country of accreditation, Ecuador. If Chile hasn't ratified the agreement, then it's not at the table. So the terms that the TPP countries agreed to with the United Kingdom, with China, with anybody that comes on board, if Chile's not at the table, then it's not party to those negotiations. So it can't help shape the nature of that agreement. So that we think that's a disadvantage.
So you touched on something that I believe that it's quite important today, and this has been, we've been seeing this on the press about, how foreign policy and democracy. And I believe that this might be interested for everybody here today. We have a very young audience. Is you talk about how the TTP was negotiated, in a closed room, closed environment. It wasn't open for the population. But the look, and I didn't mention this at the very beginning. I work in the I used to work in the Chilean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, negotiating free trade agreements. And every time that we wanted to negotiate something new, or we had different processes, we would contact companies and exporters. And you know what? Nobody would reply. Nobody. Absolutely nobody. We would send thousands of emails. We would open a website like, okay, we have trade talks with Australia, with New Zealand. Is there anything that you want to bring up? And nobody would reply. And then once we were having the discussion, the conversation, well, something would appear on the press, and then there would be this huge discussion on the media. So this really represents a major dilemma for foreign policy, because look, when we talk about, let's say, I don't know, healthcare policy, education, there's so many stakeholders, and people know what we're talking about, because those type of policies have a direct impact on people's pocket, right? It's rather obvious. But when we're talking about foreign policy, it's a little bit different. And even if the government, like what I used to do in the Chilean government, when we try to engage with the larger population, most people don't respond. So where do you draw the line? What do you do? And this is a real issue for foreign policy in general. It goes way beyond trade policy, and it's a major issue of the 21st century.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. I mean, the impression I had when I was last posted here, and this was when Chile was concluding its big free trade agreement. So it had done the US, and when I was here, you concluded, or you were negotiating with China, Korea, Japan, so really
Mid
big
2000s.
Yeah, 2004, 5, 6. Mario Matos and others that I used to go and meet with, and the impression I had then was that there seemed to be a national consensus. It didn't seem to be all that contentious that Chile would sign an FTA with Korea, for example. And I remember distinctly watching in the Chilean media what was happening in Korea. I mean, there were images of Korean farmers setting themselves alight at the ports, and in Chile there was, I didn't, at least maybe I was just not speaking to the right people or focus. I was speaking with the negotiators, but in the time since, it seems that sort of consensus, if it even existed, has sort of started to unravel a little bit. But the debate you're having here is the same debate we've had in Australia. So I did want to. The one thing you said was, when you were at Vidicon and you would, not you personally, but the government would consult with business. And one of the really important things, and I think this has come out in the discussion at the moment about, there's a Subsecretario Almada talked about, setting up this consultative process. So we do something like that, and I'm not saying what we do is adequate, but there's multiple elements to it. So if we're thinking of negotiating a new free trade agreement with whoever, we will call for public submissions. We will hold hearings. So Chile, you've got one big city. So if you wanted to sort of go and meet with industry, you're probably going to do it in Santiago. Whereas in Australia, we will have a meeting in Canberra, but then more importantly in Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide and Brisbane and Perth, on the big state capitals. We will have our trade officials go and say, look, this is what we're thinking. What are your views? And I think our experience has been that it's important that everybody, all stakeholders, have an opportunity to comment. So it's an open invitation. As you say, if you send out a call on your webpage or on Twitter or something asking for submissions, you're not going to get a lot. So sometimes there's a need to be a little bit more proactive, I suppose. So So we do that every time there's a new negotiation. We have a standing stakeholder meeting that you know, Joe and I used to go to. I used to go and talk about the FTAs that I was responsible for. And in the room you'll have so and this is a group of stakeholders that we would invite. So we'd have, you know, obviously the agriculture industry, the mining industry, you know, the services roundtable, financial services people. But we would also have the union movement there. We'd have multiple representatives from the union movement. We might have, you know, organisations with a human rights focus. There are a couple of other civil society groups that are. I mean, I'm just thinking the best way to put it, but that aren't convinced of the merits of free trade agreements. So it's a much more, I suppose it's an easy conversation to have if they're not in the room, but I think it's important that they are in the room and they have the opportunity to be heard. But the issue that you talked about, having a lack of input, was frustrating, is frustrating. But I think in order to, you know, just to proceed, if the government makes a decision to proceed with a particular negotiation, sign a particular agreement, I think it's important that you've at least gone through the process and you've given people the opportunity to express their views, so that you're making a decision based on all of the views that are out there.
The major problem that I see with this is that, okay, so you open the consultation process, you try to listen to the people, then people are not very interested. Okay, so what do? You move forward, and then once you're negotiating, once you have this in Congress, there's a minority that starts making noise, and that becomes a huge problem. And that's the major issue that I see with this process, because on the one hand you have some kind of policy consensus, but then the people can be co-opted quite easily by a small group. And I think that somewhat that's what we've seen in Chile. And these lead us to the next topic that I wanted to touch on. And I'm sure that you're being aware of that. The current Subsecretario Auma, he, you know, in a quite particular statement, he mentioned that he wanted to legitimize Chilean trade policy by opening this kind of vote about, we still don't know the content, obviously, but this really opens a huge problem, because, okay, in democracies, we know that if we have more people voting, the results will be more legitimate. It's rather obvious. If you have a leader that is elected by 20% of the population, well, that tells you something, and it's quite different that if you have 80, 90, 100%, right? So then again, we have this particular topic, which is trade policy. It's very niche. Most people are not interested about this at all, right? Even in my personal experience, even the stakeholders, even the companies, they wouldn't say anything, all right? So we know that. What happens when you open a vote for that? That could, there are major risks of that, because you're opening a vote that might determine or change somewhat trade policy, which is vital for the country. And what if the people that vote are just a small percentage of the population? That is really a major problem in these processes, and this is really the link between, you know, between policy making and democracy, which is, again, it's a big issue in modern democracies today, because it's not like in the 1900s or something.
Yeah. Look, I mean, that's what I was referring to before. Just one point, just to go back on something you said. So
go ahead, please.
So when we're talking about, you know, so you go through this consultation process, and certain people aren't going to be happy and they're going to complain. I'd sort of argue that I actually think, even if that's where you're going to end up anyway, so if you don't consult, and so you just speak with business and you just hear their interests, and then you get to Congress and you know, members of Congress aren't happy with the decision the government's taken. So that's one scenario, and the other scenario is you do consult. You basically end up where you were going to end up anyway, but at least they've been heard. So I think, I think that's important to, and I don't want to use the word legitimize but at least it gives you something to refer to. It gives you can demonstrate that there has been consultative. Because I think there's a difference between, like people have, some people have a very particular issue, they've got one focus. Might be gender, it might be animal rights, and if there's a particular outcome which doesn't meet their demand, then they're not going to be happy. But I think a government at the end of the day has to try, any government has to balance a whole range of interests. So that was just that one point. The other thing, so when you talk about a vote, so just in terms of what Subsecretario Almada has said, I mean, I think there's been some clarification given. I saw Minister Urrejola the other day, and I spoke with her the other day, and so I think it's become a bit clear. I mean, the way I understand what they're proposing looks very similar to what we do. So there's nothing in there that I'm thinking, that would for me set alarm bells ringing. But when you talk about a vote, because one of the words I've heard them use a number of times is no vinculante.
Yes.
So it's not binding. So it's a consultation, and that's exactly how it works for us. So we consult. So we speak with industry, and if you're speaking with industry and they want a particular thing, and this is our bottom line, this is what we need. Well, sometimes industry doesn't always get what it wants either. So the government needs some sort of flexibility across the board. So I'm not sure when you say a vote.
The word I read on the news was consulta pública, I believe.
Yeah,
I might be mistaken. But I think
that
was it.
I think what the government has acknowledged, and is that that maybe things weren't explained.
Right, there was some inconsistency within the.
But I think now, I mean, they've been very clear that it will be sort of. I can't remember what the exact words that the minister used, but essentially saying this will be input. This will help inform the development of our policy and our approach, but it's not going to be binding. That's important.
You're either too optimistic or a diplomat. So, all right. So
I'm a pessimist by nature. But,
okay, just a final question before we jump into the students' questions, and this is of personal interest, and we were talking about this a little bit while we were walking here. There was just a general election in Australia, so. Are you expecting any kind of change in terms of foreign policy, either foreign policy in general, maybe towards China? And that's a little bit out of the topic that we're talking today, but if you can explain a little bit of that and about trade policy as well. Any changes that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think, as I said at the beginning, I mean, on trade policy, I'm not expecting any major shifts. I mean, there are some sort of, for the trade policy nerds, there might be some issues like ISDS. Does everybody know what that is? It's investor-state dispute settlement provision. So that's something that the Boric government has identified as being of concern to them. And in Australian politics, in trade policy discussions, that has been one area of difference. So the new government, it's indicated that it's not going to sign on to onto any new agreements that include ISDS. So there's a difference there, but they have done so in the past. So we'll have to wait and see. It's very early days. I mean, the Prime Minister was only sworn in yesterday, so we're still waiting to get some detail. But what the Prime Minister did say on the night that on Saturday night when he sort of accepted or came out and spoke and acknowledged that he'd won, the first thing he talked about was moving quickly to try and get recognition in our constitution of our Indigenous, our Aboriginal people. Because in the debate here, often I hear references to Australia, as an example. We don't actually have any reference to our Indigenous people in our constitution, and changing our constitution is notoriously difficult. We very rarely make changes to our constitution. So what you're going through is just completely mind-blowing, that you completely rewrite a constitution. So for us, we haven't done that. So Indigenous issues will be big. Climate change. So this new government is committed to taking action on climate change. So and gender is another issue. So I think and that's going to be that'll be reflected in our trade in our foreign policy approach. But I think you can also expect to see that in our free trade agreement. So in addition to being ambassador here, I'm also our chief negotiator with the Pacific Alliance. So for our free trade agreements, our free trade agreement negotiations I lead, but we haven't actually been negotiating for a couple of years because of COVID, because of a couple of issues that we still haven't been able to resolve. And in those negotiations, a couple of the issues that have been more contentious is, should we have a labour chapter? Should we have an environment chapter? I think, our previous government, it wasn't a red line issue. I think with this new government, I'm guessing here, an educated guess, I think it's going to be more of a priority for us. But I don't think in terms of the way we work with Chile, it's going to amount to anything that's going to be a problem between us. I think I'm hopeful, I'm confident that we'll continue to work very closely and cooperatively with Chile in FTA negotiations in APEC, for example.
You're describing a trade policy closer to the Canadian one with the current government. They have really taken these issues like climate change, so on and so forth.
Yeah, the progressive trade agenda.
Yeah,
New
that's
Zealand.
right.
So it used to be New Zealand, Canada, and Chile were the sort of three. Something more like that.
Okay, fair enough. All right, I think we can jump into some questions from the audience, from the students. So
sure.
I think it might be a good time to do that. So let's. Okay, guys. So questions. It can be either in Spanish or English. The ambassador here speaks perfect Spanish, so please go ahead.
Tenemos una pregunta acá de alguien del público por Zoom. ¿Hay alguna página para conocer empresas que estén interesadas en colaborar en Chile, organizadas por rubro?
No creo que haya una página con una lista de empresas, pero sí eso sería más una pregunta para la oficina comercial de la embajada, Austrade. Entonces, si van a la página de la embajada, ahí hay una pestaña para ir a Austrade. Pero cualquier duda, Juan Pablo se puede comunicar conmigo y yo les hago llegar el correo.
Totalmente.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, good morning, Ambassador. I wanted to ask you, what are the key areas in which Chile and Australia could deepen their relationship?
So I think, like of all the countries in Latin America, we have a very deep relationship with Chile already. So maybe just sort of thinking about maybe some new areas for cooperation, for collaboration. I think those issues that I talked about before, in a trade policy sense, some of these progressive trade issues, I think we can sort of work closely together there. Some sort of emerging areas that I mentioned before in terms of some of these new emerging industries where Australia and Chile have a comparative advantage and considerable wealth, green hydrogen, lithium, and sort of sharing with one another our experience in terms of making our mining industries more sustainable. So that's something that the Boric government has emphasised. It's not anti-mining. It recognises the importance of mining, but mining has to be done in a sustainable way. And I know with the Australian companies that operate here and operate in Australia, all of them operate in Australia before they operated here. They have to meet the very demanding requirements that we set in Australia, and so they bring that experience with them. So I think for the two countries, and we can do it at the company, at the sort of the business level, but we also have CSIRO, which is that science the research organisation that we have, which is funded by the government. But we also have people like the University of Queensland Sustainable Minerals Institute. So there's a lot of areas where there's significant potential and understandably around the sectors that are important for our economy. And also the other issue which is a big preoccupation for us, because like you, we suffer from drought always, is water management. So there's just water management. Yeah, so, just to make sure that our farmers and our industry have enough water and they make the most efficient use possible of the very limited water that we have available. Sorry? Innovation, yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Just a quick comment on that. I think it's quite relevant, how Chile can be some sort of hub in the region for Australian services. I mean, oh,
Hi, hello.
Sorry, I think we have one down the front here first.
I am pleased to greet Ambassador Mercer in the name of Dorotea Lopez, the director of the Instituto de Estudios Internacionales. In the face of world changes, political changes, and also other more specific changes in the future, in the planning of the future of the world and of our countries. I think that this is a particularly good moment to emphasize a good relationship between Chile and Australia. I am proud to be working part of my time in Australia, just back a month ago, and was a witness of the effects of the lockdown in Melbourne. You can still see it very well. And I wonder if we could enlist your contribution to make our relationships between the Institute and the Conversazione led by Professor Velis in Australia, if we could strengthen that, because I think it's very important to be joined in a joint a name aiming at the peace of the world and the development, a true development of our countries. May we count on your contribution, Ambassador Ransom?
Sure. I mean, I sort of feel that my whole life, since I met my wife 31 years ago, has been about sort of promoting a bilateral relationship. So I'm very happy to add to that. But yeah, and we think that, I think you mentioned the work and holiday program. I mean, those people-to-people links that exist between Australia and Chile are fundamental. So, immigration from Chile to Australia was very important. But I think it's waning and it's important. I think it's still there, and there's those family-to-family links. But having younger people go to Australia for a work experience, to study, but very interested in developing, encouraging links between research organisations, between educational institutions. I've got to know people at Athena Labs, so think tanks, and they're developing ties with counterparts in Australia. So there's no one answer, but if there's a specific request that you have, or if you want us to make an introduction for you, very happy to do that. So maybe at the end I'll give you my card and you can send me an email, and happy to sort of see what we can do to help out. Thank you.
Y vamos con la última pregunta. Hello.
Hi.
Many students here are in a course that it's called Global Trends, where we analyze different trends in the world that get shared and can potentially change behaviors or get reproduced everywhere. I wanted to know if you know of any trend that started in Australia, or if you have gotten to know any trends that have been reproduced even here or somewhere other parts of the world, and if you had seen any benefits or consequences from it. It can be anything, not in the trade world. It can be.
Yeah. I don't know. Looking to my fellow Australian here to see if there's if we have any ideas. Yeah, I'm sort of, but one thing comes to mind, but it's a sort of a little bit dated. The Clean Up Australia campaign. I mean, just sort of, there's a, it's really it's a very dated example, but it's something that sort of had a real impact initially. So it was this sort of idea that people needed to take responsibility for their own neighbourhood and keeping their community clean. And it was this one guy who was a sailor. So he used to sail. He was like me. He was from Sydney, and he had a sailboat, and he would go out onto Sydney Harbour, which is a beautiful harbour. I think all Sydney-siders, attracted to the centre of the city. And he would be sailing his boat, lovely blue skies, great weather, but there'd be all this rubbish in the harbour. So, that was something that was sort of a community sort of based initiative. And I remember when I was on my first posting in Mexico, we actually went to, I remember going to a little town called Tlaxcala, and and so it sort of had a bit of a reach globally. And I don't think it has the reach, but you look in a lot of these towns, because I went back to Mexico a second time, and I remember going back to this town, and it had its own, I don't know what it was called, but they had their own thing. So I mean, just looking for something that resonates. That was it was ahead of its time, because now I think people, particularly younger people like you, are much more environmentally conscious than maybe people of my generation and my parents' generation, where it's just somebody else will pick up the rubbish. That's a really bad example, and I can't think of anything else at the moment, but if I think of one, I'll give it to Juan Pablo and pass it on. So sorry about that. Was that the last question? Yeah.
All right.
Right.
Thank you so much, then. Thank you,
Thank you.
Ambassador. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. Good.